Okay, let me maybe start kicking this off. First and foremost, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Eva Brzezinska, and I lead ISD's trade and climate change work. And I welcome you to this ISD organized session that is called The Brave New World of Border Carbon Adjustments, just like here. We know it's a proper novelty of international trade policy toolbox. It's very closely linked to government's response to urgent needs to reduce carbon emissions and combat climate change. They do have potential to support the increased climate conditions, but it doesn't come without a cost. There are serious concerns linked to the implementation of those measures, especially if multiple measures would be introduced with different requirements. There are questions about developing countries' capacity to adjust to them. I think we'll try to cover these topics in the next coming hour. And here I will be particularly delighted to listen into our excellent panel of speakers, of which currently we have Mr. Johnny Peters, who is the Chief of Staff at E3G, an independent climate change think tank, where until very recently he still read international trade work.
That's right.
Before he moved to a broader and greener pastures at the same organization. He has really worked on CBAM issue for a long time, including at the UK's context. Dr. Armand Bourdou, I hope that I'm getting it right. He's the Secretary General of Istanbul Minerals and Metal Exporters Association, IMID for sure, which is the largest exporters association of Turkey, a PhD lecturer at, I think, even 2 universities. He was delivering courses regularly on international trade and emerging markets. And last but not least, Ms. Tatiana Poyosova, who is a senior associate at Van Wiel and Bellis. She co-leads the VVB's CBAM task force and advises private and public clients on implementation of CBAMs, among other, I think, climate measures across the globe. She knows very well compatibility, but also policy issues. So let me very quickly just set a couple of guidelines of how we're going to run the show. I'll very quickly invite each of the speakers to deliver some initial remarks, and I'll then invite them themselves and the roundtable, and to an extent that I can see all the participants of this panel, to just shoot questions to our panelists. We'll do it one by one, and then if we have some general time at the end, we can continue the exchanges until the end of the hour. With that, I'm asking Johnny to kick us off.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Eva. Thank you so much for having us here today, and welcome to the start as well of the ISD forum here. Very good to see such a busy roundtable. It's fantastic. Yeah, so as Eva said, I'm Johnny Peters, Chief of Staff at E3G. And to kick us off, really, I'm going to kind of try and cover 3 main things just to kind of ground the conversation today. So firstly, the kind of national political and policy context in which we found carbon border adjustments first arriving, so I think it's good to recap that. The geopolitical context then in which we find these measures today, and I think the title of the session is very good, A Brave New World in which we find ourselves in. And lastly, just some reflections on me on how we actually reconcile the two and perhaps start charting a course to more constructive bilateral relations and multilateral relations in this space as well. So to begin with, on the national political and policy context, I think it's worth going back to basics in terms of where, firstly, the EU CBAM proposal came from, and now since the UK CBAM and others we're seeing in the pipeline as well. And it is primarily to address what they call the carbon leakage risk. And so going back to basics here, the EU has its emissions trading system, and basically what happens is you've got a carbon price that is essentially going up over time. Of course, there are fluctuations, but what happens is the European Union sometimes feels at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis other players, and there's a potential for carbon leakage threat, which is essentially either industrial emissions or industrial activity itself to relocate from the EU to other jurisdictions because of that carbon price differential. And that's where the carbon border adjustment comes in. And I think it's worth going over some of this sort of context to begin with, because really the EU's proposal came from ultimately trying to address a competitive disadvantage risk in its industrial base, first and foremost. That's where this policy proposal came from. I think it's fair to say that the international implications of some of this perhaps came slightly secondary to some of that thinking when that was first coming up. But really it's worth going back to basics on that, because in some respects it's worth remembering how, in a sense, we are confined to those ETS sectors. So it's the industrial sectors primarily, so steel, cement, aluminium, in some discussions we see some conversations of carbon border adjustments going wider, but I do think it's worth remembering that the European proposal is limited in that respect, and that's really the context that we're arriving from here. But of course, those primarily sort of national conditions, if you like, then start to interact with the international context, and this is where we find ourselves starting to now, increasingly bit by bit. It's funny, some organisations like Mine 3G at the very start were saying you should be thinking about the international implications of these things from the policy design outset stage, and some of those arguments weren't quite cutting through at the start, but they're starting to cut through now, because we've seen, particularly I think most recently, vividly at COP28, we saw in the context of the global stocktake text, unilateral measures being risen for the first time by the basic group of countries, so Brazil, South Africa, India, China, in earnest raising these issues for the first time that we've seen really in the climate space, these issues coming to the fore. And let's be real, it was a real clash, and the European Union was really on the front line having to defend itself here, because it didn't have essentially much in the way of an international offer when it was coming back to what was, as I said before, initially a policy measure that was designed to remedy a national kind of political context. And so the tensions now are emerging, and those of you that follow the WTO space will of course see a lot of work on adjustments coming up and unilateral measures coming up, and these things will continue in future. But so we've reached this point now where the tensions are here. So the next question is, what do we do about it in this brave new world? So I think a lot of the time it was interesting for us as an organisation when we were at the earlier policy design stage for the EU CBAM. Essentially what we came back to a lot of the time was saying, okay, you've got this essentially revenue raising potential coming in from the CBAM, you're essentially attaching a tariff measure at the border, you will be raising some revenue. How about recycling some of that revenue for international climate finance for developing country partners? Because it's ultimately particularly LDCs that will struggle the most, I think, to deal with the more technical requirements of the EU CBAM proposal. And so that was kind of what we were pushing for at the time. That argument didn't cut through. It's a classic thing, really, when you're suddenly trying to argue with DG taxes in the EU. They say, oh, well, we don't hypothecate revenue. Revenue comes in, it comes into a budget, and that's where it stays. We don't attach specific budget lines, and that's why we can't do this thing in this way. But unfortunately, hypothecation is something that actually happens all the time, right? Even though you might not conflate a direct budget line, the fact is you do still make political kind of statements and say, yes, a proportion of this revenue can be dedicated in this way. So we're not really talking about specific budget lines here. We're talking about actually that discursive element and saying, yes, we will raise our climate finance in parallel to the revenue raising of this measure. And I think that would go a long way. But I think I will actually just sort of wrap up to say that actually I don't think this is just limited to recycling some revenue for climate finance. And I don't think that's just the EU potentially working with others now. You've got others like the UK or others in the G7 looking to move in this space. They could potentially recycle revenue in a shared international pot. So you've seen measures like the G7 Climate Club, for instance, which is now that started to take more shape at COP28 as well. And that could be another kind of mechanism for essentially pooling some of those resources in the G7 if they're moving in a similar direction, and also recycling revenue in that way. But let's be real, I think certainly to begin with in the opening 10 years of the EU CBAM, I think the revenue raising potential is actually going to be quite small. This measure is actually quite limited in some respects. I know a lot of the politics kind of comes out as to say this measure is huge, and it is hugely significant, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to undo it, but I think in terms of direct revenue raising potential in its first few years, I don't think we're actually talking about hugely significant sums of money. So the next step is actually to think, okay, it's not just about finance. I think this is more to do with actually the political partnerships that you're building around it. So the financing piece is obviously very, very important, but really I think the real prize here is actually moving into a space where you have more proactive bilateral relations and ultimately multilateralizing, potentially through the G7 and other mechanisms like I mentioned before, those kind of more consistent political relations so you can air out these concerns in the right forums and discuss them all properly. Because the one anecdote that I'll put interestingly, finally, just to conclude, is actually, interestingly, of the BRICS countries, the one that actually seems to have now the most kind of constructive tone on a lot of this stuff is actually India, which is, we're here at MC13 and India's got quite a strong role at the moment in the multilateral context. But interestingly, on the CBAM context, because India has had its TTC relationship with the EU, so a parallel trade dialogue in parallel to its FTA negotiations with the EU, you've actually started seeing India refine its asks in the carbon border adjustment space. So they're now focusing particularly on the issues that they care about in their political economy, so that's SMEs really, it's small and medium enterprises, because ultimately that's where a lot of their competitive issues lie. And really, actually, a lot of their asks in this space are becoming increasingly constructive because they have that space with the European Union to talk these things through and refine actually the asks that they have. So that for me is the big lesson in terms of if you create these spaces, you can create the dialogues, you can create the political context in which you can make these things work. And obviously finance is a big part of that, and I'm sure there are other things that will need to be part of it too. But it's not impossible to reconcile those national and geopolitical contexts, as I said at the start.
Thank you so much, Johnny. Really, the conflict and reconciliation that still seems quite away, right?
Of course.
I'm turning to our panel members, just checking if you would have questions for Johnny from your side before I will open the wider floor. Maybe we should. Okay, let's plug in. So, geopolitical context, India. Would anybody want to ask a question at this point? No. I do have one that, as a moderator, you're talking about this reconciliation. Yes, we all feel like this conflict will need to be managed. And you mentioned the WTO. You mentioned a little bit of climate clubs. So where do you think this conversation can be happening? Because the bilateral conversations are clearly not sufficient. You will be able to clean out one situation, say EU-India. But what about UK CBAM?
Yeah.
What about the news coming out from Australia? What about news coming from Brazil and Vietnam that I know Tatiana will probably touch upon? So what is a forum?
Yeah, well, I think in a sense you actually almost started to answer that yourself in terms of, I think initially we've dealt with this as specifically an EU proposal that has had sort of international pushback, and increasingly we're now seeing more and more countries move into this space as well, and equally more and more countries working out what their kind of complaints are in this space as well. So the space is developing, and essentially the debate is almost multilateralizing itself in some respects because it's moving out from just a bilateral kind of issue into a more international one. So I think those are the dynamics at play. I think to go back to the kind of the UK context, I think what we're learning about the EU's proposal is remarkably similar to the EU's. I mean, obviously, many of us know that the UK recently was part of the EU, and so and the UK has its own emissions trading system, which was essentially a copy and paste job from the EU ETS when the UK left. So its CBAM will naturally look and feel very similar to the EU's, bar some specific differences. Again, going back to the national political economy, it's not in the UK's interest to include electricity in scope because it's a net electricity importer, and it's not in the UK's interests. It is in the UK's interest rather to include glass and ceramics because it has more industrial competence in that space. So, but these are marginal differences really when the overall framework is about going back to essentially shoring up its carbon pricing system domestically in the threat of that carbon leakage risk. As I said before, that's primarily where the UK is coming from. So if we're seeing others moving into this space, I think we will see it evolve further. As I say, there are slightly more marginal evolutions on the model of CBAM itself from the UK, but I think as others with more different regulatory systems like Australia, and we move into potentially others as well, I think the whole concept of the carbon border adjustment itself will move on. It won't just simply be it's an EU plus type proposal. It'll start mirroring those kind of national political circumstances, like I said before. So it won't just be a bilateral issue anymore. It will start to multilateralize as an issue. There will be a plurality of different measures for us to need to reconcile, both on the proposal side in terms of those countries that want to enact carbon border adjustments, but also on the receiving end in terms of those countries that are exposed. So it won't just be those that are particularly exposed to the EU CBAM, but it'll be those that are exposed to the UK's, Canada, Australia, those others as they move into the future. And that's where I think the discussion ends up becoming pluralateralized, multilateralized over time. But really, I think to have those more specific discussions and the more successful ones, like I said before, I think you begin with the kind of bilateral space. EU-India TTC, like I said before, offers of finance, I think, could be something in that space that could really help reinforce some of those things. But potentially, as I say, plurilateralizing through the G7 and working up eventually to the multilateral space, I think would be the logical course of these things to go.
Absolutely, and as many international forces, right, probably starts bilaterally, moves to a smaller group and then goes ahead. But it really sounds like when we start looking at the CBAMs created on a basis on non-ETS systems, once we will start seeing what Canada is doing with their system, how Australians are approaching, we might be seeing a much bigger diversity of CBAMs than the EU's and UK's, of course.
That's exactly right.
And then this is what brings me, and unless there are further questions to Johnny, please do, sir. If you could present yourself before.
Yeah, I'm Secretary General of Turkish Steel Producers Association. My name is Veysel Yayan. I wonder if we put the carbon leakage, one of the determinant factor in this picture, do you think that it will be risky to some extent to mix with the carbon leakage with the protectionist measures? And some subjective criteria may come to the agenda, and to which extent it will negatively affect the CBAM procedures. What is your opinion on this issue?
Yeah, definitely. No, it's a great question. I think that's why I started my remarks by going back to the pure carbon leakage issue, because this is where this came from, right? The original EU proposal is 2018, 2019 proposal that eventually started to come alive. But I think the EU's been unfortunate, right, in that its measure coming online at the same time as things like the United States Inflation Reduction Act. I think you've started to see the EU CBAM start to be conflated with measures like those that are going on, those kind of unilateral measures, and these things have come together to create this huge kind of overbearing political discourse, which becomes, quite a difficult thing to unpack. And so you saw the European Union at COP28, for instance, trying to unpack, there are specific things that we want to do in this space, but we've got this overbearing issue, which is all things carbon and competitiveness that we've got to now tackle because these issues have come together. And I think we would do ourselves some favours, I think, to start to strip these things back and go back to the original policy design, implications of these things, to kind of do ourselves some favours to understand these things a little bit more. But you're right about this is the politics and this is how these things are interacting, and you can't essentially just say, I only want to treat this as a policy issue because we don't live in that world, but this is the politics that we're going to have to grapple with. But ultimately, I think the European Union needs to step up with more of a political offer in that space, but I think what a lot of countries really want to see is actually the kind of policy measures put in place to address some of the concerns underneath. So it's both a political craft and a policy kind of technical craft as well at the same time.
Good enough.
So I registered two gentlemen who want to ask questions. Can I ask you to ask questions one after the other, and then we'll pass the floor to Johnny, and then we'll wrap up this part of the discussion and move on to the next speaker, sir, and then Mr. after you. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Paul Rübig. I'm a member of the European Economic and Social Committee. We are an advisory body for the European institutions, and for many years I was a member of the European Parliament. So thank you so much. I think the border carbon adjustment mechanism is a very interesting mechanism because from basic view, the targets to get the world into a better situation in environmental area is the right point. But for us, the question is, what are the costs of such an cross-border adjustment mechanism, and who has most of the benefit from financial point of view out of these activities? And we all know that the SMEs, which are in the background of the big companies, have to pay with a lot of bureaucracy and paperwork to get it done. So my question is, how do you think the impact on foreign direct investment will be? You said it totally correct, because the carbon leakage is something where our industry in Europe is now thinking where to invest, where can we escape, and on the other side we will have some monopolies or oligopolies who feel quite well in this new system because they are protected.
I'll just ask for a second question like this.
Yeah, okay. Hello everyone, my name is Mustafa Bayoumi. I'm a climate change research fellow at the Diplomatic Academy here in the UAE. Sorry, I have two short but specific questions. So my first one is, you mentioned recycling some of the revenues that might kind of come from CBAM into climate finance. My question is, why not exempt some countries such as LDCs in the first place? Because we know that in many cases the climate finance has not reached the countries and not in the amounts that it should have. And then my second question is related particularly to unilateral trade measures. So I was supporting the COP28 team and was advising them during the COP in the negotiations, and it really came up in almost all the rooms. Yeah. So to your point on the dialogue, India having a dialogue with EU and so on, I think we would need something much bigger and much more effective than dialogues. So if you have any ideas on, because this will come up in COP29, this will come up in COP30, I think we managed to kind of contain it in COP28 because it seemed like quite a significant concern for many countries, but it will come up again. And so if you have any thoughts on how to do it.
Really helpful.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, great. So on the FDI side of things, yeah, it's a really interesting question because I think, we came back to this point about the kind of political context in which we find ourselves, right? In some respects, a lot of the competitiveness issues that are facing domestic European industry in the EU and the UK, the impacts of the energy crisis, so high energy prices, declining industrial output, and so on. Carbon border adjustment, I don't think, is particularly helpful in this context in terms of, or rather, that's not the purpose of the measure, is to address those issues. So you've got these macro economic shifts going on, which are much more significant than actually things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And so to your point about impacts on FDI flows and so on like that, we've got a much bigger economic issue at play than just the kind of pure carbon leakage thing that I was mentioning to you before about keeping these things separate in terms of how we tackle them. So really, I think I would go back to actually those bigger shifts in terms of things like Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act and things like that, those huge subsidy programs and rollouts of investment over there. Those sorts of competitiveness issues, I think, are much more of an FDI drawer in that kind of space, and anything that the carbon border adjustment will do to really shift those kind of patterns. Of course, these things stack up and they start to impact on each other, and they're part of the same puzzle. But I think it's worth separating them out a little bit in terms of how we tackle them and how we want to tackle these issues kind of going forward. And I think that's why really what we need to see is much more in the way of carbon border adjustment mechanisms becoming part more clearly of concerted industrial strategies, having a much more clear understanding of how carbon border adjustments fit as a pillar of industrial strategy, to work with those codependencies, to think about things like FDI flows in a more comprehensive way, to talk about the intersections in that way. So a bit of a fudge of an answer to your question, but hopefully that tackles it a little bit. On exemptions, so we worked closely with the European Union on this when it was being considered, and it was close at one point to being decided. There were certain EU DGs that were in favour of exemptions. In the end, the argument that won it, and I can see why, was actually, ultimately, it was a trump card about the WTO compatibility of the measure, really. Because what they were saying, I don't know how correct this really is as an answer, because we were also in favour of some of the exemptions arguments, but they were saying that actually this needs to be a non-discriminatory measure, ultimately. We need this to apply to everyone equally for it to be WTO compatible. And that's why the exemptions didn't work. I mean, there's also other things on a more real economy focus, whereby actually if you exempt some countries, you create loopholes in the measure, and you can start to encourage actually more dirty investment going into those countries that are exempt from the CBAM. So there are perverse outcomes that you can see there, which I'm more sympathetic to as an argument. But I think, to be honest, there are ways that you could mitigate some of these impacts. So I don't think, anyway, that's where we landed in terms of why they've moved away from it. I think the recycling revenue point can be sufficient enough. It's interesting though, because like I said before, I don't think the CBAM revenues are actually going to be particularly large. And when you talk about some of the deficits that we have in climate financing more broadly, I don't think we should be looking to CBAM revenue as one of the main ways to plug that gap, because it's going to be far short of the amount that we need. So I massively agree with you there. So again, it needs to be part of a broader financing package, part of a broader way in which we talk about these things. And so it dovetails onto your last point, which is about the conversation that was at COP28 and needing something much, much bigger. I definitely take your point about ultimately now unilateral measures more generally are being conflated, right? So things as diverse as the Inflation Reduction Act and the EU's carbon border adjustment have been pulled into this one massive pool of things that we somehow need to tackle. I do think we can rise this political challenge though, because we talk about the uptake in climate financing that we need. I think if we can talk about methods like the G7 Climate Club for pooling at least the kind of CBAM recycling type tools, but going forward into a more forward-leaning conversation about actually how are we wanting to deploy climate finance for industrial decarbonisation more broadly, because this area is one of the underfinanced areas more broadly. There's much more that I think G7 type countries will want to do in the partnership space with priority countries. Interestingly, a funny little one that's popped up recently, but the UK actually has a really strong bilateral partnership with Brazil, and it's based on industrial decarbonisation more generally. I think they've been looking ahead to Brazil's G20 presidency and then their COP30 presidency as opportunities for landing some of these things. And they're doing some really interesting space in this space. Unfortunately, the UK is not one of the biggest donors in this space, so we're not seeing it come forward with a ton of money, but the policy dialogue is very, very strong. So there's lots that we can look to there in terms of maybe replicating it more in an EU-Brazil measure type thing, for instance, but actually thinking about more of the climate financing potential there that they might have. So yeah, I think to wrap up really, I think we're now in a space where kind of carbon border adjustments are becoming a global reality, right? Like we're not in the space no longer of just pushing back and saying these things aren't happening because they're happening. So if they are becoming a global reality, it needs to be cooperative partnerships really that need to come back to address these international concerns. Those will be the ways that we do these things. And that's both political partnerships, I think it's financing partnerships as well. Ultimately, I think if we can be thinking about building those more political conversations into things like technology transfer conversations, I think that could be very, very helpful. And I think at the very least, technical assistance to help countries meet these measures, I think.
Excellent. So from policymaking to policy implications and to the actual impact on the ground, I invite Dr. Vurdu to tell us a little bit about the first impacts that the CBAM is already having on the industries that belong to your association.
Okay, thank you very much for your invitation, and I'm very happy to be here with this esteemed audience and speakers. Actually, I will mention three headlines in my speech. First of all, I would like to introduce my association and remark what IMEP does and how it relates to BCA, and what EU CBAM means for our country, and then I will try to raise the key concerns of the developing countries on the issue, if you allow me. Actually, we represent 6 of the biggest exporting industries, which constitute the 40% of goods exports of Turkey, with 50,000 member companies. And our works focus on leveraging the export potential of our members. So we organize B2B meetings, international fair participations, trainings, sectoral gatherings to discuss the current trends and challenges. And we conduct market research and thematic research papers for public outreach. And our industries are energy incentive ones, some of which are included in the EU CBAM right now. Our field of responsibility includes steel, ferrous and non-ferrous metals, including aluminium, electricity and electronics, mines, jewelry, chemicals, and chemical products, including plastics, which is not prioritized now, but accepted to be in the EU CBAM soon. Therefore, we are delicately trying to relay information and guidance about the border carbon adjustments and EU CBAM to our members, actually. Why EU CBAM is important for Turkey? Because 42% of Turkey's total exports goes to the European Union. And if you include the UK, it becomes 50%. If you include the whole European geography, it becomes 55 to 60% of our exports. So our sectors now face a big risk in terms of competitiveness in case of we do not comply with the new rules and regulations of this issue. Although we believe that we have the customs union with the European Union since 1995, although we believe that the borders of the carbon border adjustment should be the borders of the customs union, it seems not possible for the time being. But then again, in order to keep our competitive position in the European Union market, we are trying to comply with the rules. Because after COVID, you know, there, there are new terms in our life, like after offshoring, we have now nearshoring, ally-shoring, and reshoring terms. We put our position for the EU market as a nearshoring country. So that's why EU market is very important for Turkey's economy. When we come to the developing countries' concerns, as you appreciate, it is very complex and multifaceted because it's influenced by concerns about economic development, equality, equity, and environmental sustainability. Because BCAs are tariffs or levies imposed by carbon regulating countries on the carbon content of imports from countries with less stringent carbon regulations. And the first concern is, as our concern, is about competitiveness and market access. Developing countries, many of which are heavily reliant on exports to developed economies, fear that BCAs could act as trade barriers for them. And such barriers could limit their access to wealthy markets, and they can affect their economic growth and development prospects. And the second thing is equity and fairness. There is a perception of inequity associated with those adjustment mechanisms because they place an additional burden on developing countries, which are historically less responsible for global carbon emissions. For example, least developed countries are responsible only 1% of those carbon emissions. So the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is recognized in international climate agreements, acknowledge this historical inequity, and developing countries argue that BCAs could undermine this principle by not adequately considering their lower capacity to transition to low carbon technologies very quickly. And another thing is technical and financial capacity. Implementing the measures for carbon adjustment mechanisms requires significant technical and financial resources, and many developing countries lack those technical and financial capacities. So BCAs could penalize these countries for their inability to invest in cleaner technologies, further exacerbating the global technology and investment divide. And the next one is environmental effectiveness and global climate policy. Some developing countries recognize the potential of BCAs to incentivize global carbon emissions reductions, but there's skepticism about their overall effectiveness and fairness without accompanying measures that support the transition in less developed economies. And last but not the least, the legal and regulatory challenges are important. Developing countries are also concerned about the compatibility of BCAs with World Trade Organization rules and the potential of disputes that could arise. That's why I believe international cooperation and WTO's governance is the path to decarbonize altogether in a harmonized way. Otherwise, we will have a fragmented world in terms of trade, and it will not help to prosper together.
Thank you, Dr. Boudou. And definitely, this is a big question: pioneering or really walking slower but together. With this, let me have a good look around for potential questions for Dr. Boudou, if anybody would come with this. I don't see anyone again, so let me maybe ask a quick question to you. The EU CBAM, in terms of compliance, already demanded a lot of efforts to prepare and follow the regulations. Are you following the processes globally, and will probably come to Tatiana again for that, but how concerned are you about that fragmentation, and how confident you would be in your industry's ability to adjust to CBAMs that are different in terms of different standards, different reporting standards, in terms of different product or even sectoral coverage? How big are your concerns about it, or do you believe that there is a way to achieve naturally this overlay?
Actually, Turkey is in those efforts since long years. I mean, we are one of the signatories of Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and all those agreements on climate action. And we have also an action plan for EU's policy priorities, and I can say that we have carbon border regulations in this action plan, a green and circular economy, green finance, clean, economical and secure energy supply, sustainable agriculture, sustainable smart transportation, combating climate change, and information awareness raising activities. And we are trying to make our sectors ready for the regulations, because as I mentioned, especially European market is very important for Turkey. But then again, I would also mention that, for example, China has a carbon tax of 6 to 8 euros. Your CBAM is 10 times of this figure. So when you do not harmonize those kind of tax levels, and if you do not, harmonize the rules and regulations, there will be a diversification in trade, and there will be a problem of green and dirty, goods. And if you want to sell to European markets with the green goods, you are going to sell the dirty ones to another country. So this will this will be a negative impact on the climate change. You are trying to decrease the carbon intensity in the world, but you should do it with the concerns of climate, not the concerns of trade or the concerns of gaining revenue. We should focus on climate, not in economic terms.
This is something that we have been hearing. I see a lady. I know her, but could you please also introduce yourself for the benefit of everyone?
Yes, no problem. My name is Monica Rubiolo. I'm the head of trade promotion with the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. And I was just wondering, here in the discussions, there are perhaps some parallels to be done with many other issues that relate. I mean, the green transition is on one hand one of the big regulatory push from the EU, but there are also many other things going on in terms of increasing sustainability in different sectors, in different value chains. And there has been just recently a research paper prepared by a Swiss university, but cooperating with many others in developing countries, in particular in Brazil, in India, and in Indonesia, looking at the openness of citizens to sustainability issues and how this is becoming more and more important in terms of they want to be and to see reflected, the externals, the negative externalities in many of the industries, and see really an improvement in sustainability also in terms of climate in their countries. And there seems to be a little bit of a gap between what governments are discussing and perhaps opposing to, and what citizens in the countries want. So could not be this kind of CBAM type of schemes also a push for the country's own reform efforts in order to live up the line, let's say, to improve also the sustainability and the climate compliance of national systems is not also an opportunity to do more change?
Yeah, it is definitely an opportunity for all sustainability matters. There's not only, trade in the sustainability world. There are lots of things, and the name of our panel, A Brave New World of Carbon Adjustment. I think it's inspired. The name is inspired from Aldous Huxley's book, right? This is a dystopic book about the year 2600 or something. This is a dystopic book, but this is not, I think, this dystopia or utopia. I think if we want to live in a world, and if we want to live in a world, if we want our children and grandchildren to live in a world, a good in good conditions, we have to do those actions for sustainability. And in that book, Huxley give a message like advanced technology could not take over humans lost their humanity, he says. So it is a very important aspect of making people believe to this sustainability measures and rules, and it's also an opportunity to reach the UN's sustainability targets in the near future, I believe.
Thank you, Dr. Urdu. On behalf of everyone, I think you reminded us about the dangers that could be awaiting for us in the future if we don't listen to each other a little bit more. And this is a perfect segue for me actually to ask Tatiana about her experiences really globally working with corporate clients and with government clients over there. What are you hearing? Is it the concerns or is that the discussion about possibilities?
Thank you very much, Yeva, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate and to contribute to this very topical panel discussion. As Yeva mentioned, we advise both governments and corporate clients on the EU CBAM because it's already in force. And I would like to share some of the concerns and also some of the responses that we see are taken by the governments, but then also by corporate clients or by companies that are required to comply with the EU CBAM. First, as regards with the governmental perspective, so of course the key concern that has been mentioned already this morning is that the CBAM is in effect an unfair measure, or it could be even a protectionist measure that discriminates against foreign producers as compared to domestic EU producers or as compared to producers from certain third countries, in particular, for instance, those countries that are exempted from the EU CBAM. In terms of responses, what we see, there are two key responses from other non-EU countries. The first one is the adoption of explicit carbon pricing schemes in those countries that did not have explicit carbon pricing schemes. And this has to do, of course, with the fact that under the EU CBAM, there is a possibility to credit for the explicit carbon pricing in the country of production and to deduct the carbon price that was effectively paid in the country of production from the carbon price that is due upon importation into the European Union. The second type of reaction that we see is that those countries that already have an explicit carbon pricing scheme, they are considering, some already have very concrete plans to have their own border carbon adjustment schemes. And this has to do with the fact, as Dr. Wurde has mentioned, that once one major market introduces a border carbon adjustment scheme, as is the case with the EU, the dirtier production products can be redirected to other markets. And so then the same question of competitiveness arises in other countries that have explicit carbon pricing schemes in place. And that is why they want also similarly to protect also their domestic producers and to avoid carbon leakage issues. And they consider introducing their own border carbon adjustment scheme. And we know that, for instance, the UK is now quite advanced with its plans and has officially announced that it will introduce UK CBAM in 2027, and the detailed consultations on the UK CBAM are going to take place later this year. Now, from the perspective of the business, I would like to mention probably three most common concerns that we hear. Of course, more generally, as was mentioned by Dr. Wurdu, there is this question of competitiveness on the EU market, which is a very important market for many foreign producers. But more practically, I think what we hear is that foreign producers very often, once they pass this question of are these measures fair and what do they do to our competitiveness, they really look into how to comply. And the question is, can you comply with those rules? Now, to comply with the rules, you need to understand what those rules are and have a very clear guidance on specific technical elements as well, and also have enough time. And so I think one of the major concerns, at least at this initial phase of the introduction of the UCBAM, by foreign producers that we've heard, was that there is not enough time. It's too short time between the adoption of the rules, including, for instance, the technical rules. So just to give an example, for the transitional periods, the implementing regulation setting out very detailed technical rules on carbon accounting was published in August 2023. The transitional period started on the 1st of October 2023. So for companies, even that have certain carbon emission monitoring schemes and so on and so forth, for bigger companies, it's very difficult to introduce within a very short period of time to implement this type of complex technical rules. The second concern relates to the fact that in many industries, in many countries, producers already follow certain emission accounting standards, because there are certain industry standards, international standards in that field. Under the UCBAM, there is very limited in time opportunity to rely on those other emission accounting standards. So during the transitional period, there is a temporary derogation. The question then arises, what happens after that? So in essence, the UCBAM imposes the EU emission accounting standard which essentially mirrors the EU ETS rules. And the third concern that has been also mentioned by Dr. Wurdu is that without international cooperation, the proliferation of different CBAMs that rely on potentially different standards of emission accounting will definitely have an effect on competitiveness, and also will lead inevitably to higher compliance costs and may have unintended consequences for the green transition. Because what we hear is that also sometimes companies would want to make financial calculations as to what the compliance costs are and whether it makes more sense to divert their exports to another market where the costs will be lower. And in the end effect, this type of policies could actually not credit the greener producers for all what they do. So I'll stop here in case there are any questions to allow for me to address them. Thank you.
I'll have a look around the table. Anyone?
I can come in with something if it's least helpful.
Go first. I'll let you both ask a question, and I'll ask Tatiana to cover them. And I see Ilaria. And okay, we have 5 questions. We have a bit of time, so let's start from the side. I'll invite again everybody to speak up and remind people who you are.
Okay, and I'm Aileen Keys, and I work for a company called Diageo. We're predominantly a Scotch whisky producer. And on the list of things that you mentioned about concerns by companies, I thought there's probably a lot of people in the room thinking, why is the Scotch Whisky Company here? But actually, we're quite often caught up in unrelated tariff disputes. So Wayne Urbis, the EU-US steel dispute, and so we absolutely support the aims of what the EU is doing in CBAM, but we're also very concerned. China's come out and said that they see it as a protectionist measure, and then that raises the risk of retaliatory tariffs. So I guess my question is, what role can the WTO play to kind of help create a consistent standard, but also kind of reduce the risk of retaliatory tariffs coming into force around these sort of things? I think it's something that could really get in the way of what is the honourable objective of CBAM. So my questions.
The role of WTO from your side, maybe Marcus and then Cesar.
Yes, thank you very much. Marcus Gehring from the Center for International Sustainable Development Law at Cambridge University. In your experience, are clients seeing the bigger picture? Are they asking their own governments? We hear, for example, from partners in Morocco that steps are being taken to institute a carbon price. We've heard from Turkey. Turkey's latest NDC has come under a lot of scrutiny because it's one of the few NDCs that's actually not more ambitious than the previous NDC. And so the question is, are industry sort of maybe using the CBAM as in conversations with their own regulators, with their own governments, to maybe be more ambitious on the carbon, in carbon matters and Paris Agreement implementation?
Thank you.
Yes,
Sir?
good morning. Olivier Jarret, also member of the Economic and Social Committee at EU level and working for the Federation of Enterprises in Belgium. Just to make the thing even more complex from European perspective, some European industries regret the fact that CBAM is to a certain extent compensating EU rules as regards import, but CBAM doesn't support the exporters. The European industry that exported that have to fulfill very high obligations in Europe, very strict rules in Europe compared to third country, and there's nothing to compensate that competitiveness advantage. So could you react on these? Should CBAM also do something to protect the European exporters and not only the importers?
Thank you. I'll follow you, lady,
Yeah.
here, and I will finish with you, Laria.
Tsonka Yotova, Economic Social Committee as well, but staff. So for me, I would argue that, okay, in terms of emission trading standards, in terms of standard setting, probably WTO is not the best body, but who will be the emission standard setting body in the world? It's because we see different systems, but I don't see an obvious body to set emission trading standards. This one, my question, maybe another question, if Mr. Vourdu has time afterwards. You said the EU CBAM should encompass the customs union as well. Turkey was thinking about emission trading mechanism as well. Where are you? Is it not easier to adopt the EU standards and then you get out of CBAM?
Maybe afterwards to come after Tatiana. So like this.
I would like to ask one more question related with gentleman from Belgium.
Let's finish with Tatiana's presentation and her answer and questions round. I'll then pass the question to Dr. Vourdu, and then if we still have time.
My question is related with him.
If we have a little bit of time, we might have time for this exchange. But now let's be just to our speakers. And Ilaria, I think you were the last one, please.
Thank you so much, Eva, and thank you so much to all the presenters. And I just have two very short questions on the issue of compliance. Especially for Tatiana, now this is very much of a concern to businesses in general, but I would assume, especially for small and medium enterprises. We've done these studies also with Joseph Francois with the World Trade Institute, and we found that for small and medium enterprises, compliance costs are just so high, and we're just so short in time that these firms are actually going to most probably predominantly turn to default values for the purposes of save a bunch of paperwork, but they are punitive in essence. So I was just wondering whether you could share a little bit of insight on on this issue and the prospects of WTO incompatibility that arises. And then I also have a more technical question because you mentioned the implementing acts, and I've been involved in carbon capture and storage technologies and this whole issue within the EU ETS and the fact that there was the exemption regime finalized and actually extended through the Fit for 55 package, but in the methodologies at the moment, you see, carbon capture and storage is not recognized on the side of the CBAM, and I just wonder whether, again, you have any experience to share on the side of business which would want to try and green new production, which is extremely, obviously, carbon intensive through these technologies, and certainly I see a very big misalignment there, and I was just wondering whether, yeah, you share this view. Yeah.
So I see the question's pouring. I'll remind Tatiana that she has around 4 minutes, so WTO's role, industry and NDCs, compensation for exporters, the CCS, the SMEs and default values. Maybe we go through this, and we'll go back to Dr. Vurdu with a question about the ATS.
Thank you so much to everyone who raised the questions. I will try to be very brief in the interest of time. So on the role of the WTO, indeed, the WTO can play and is playing a very important role in discussing these issues. The question of CBAM, but also the global sustainable steel arrangements, I think, are being raised by WTO members in different WTO committees. Now, on some other issues, for instance, on standard setting, there are some more appropriate organizations that could deal with those questions. On whether we see that the industry interacts with the government and maybe pushes the government to adopt certain new policies, I think it's really country specific, because in some countries you have more interaction and established, so to say, fora for the industry to discuss their concerns and proposals with the government. In some other countries, those mechanisms are not that well developed, so it's really country specific. But indeed, in some countries, we know that either it comes bottom up from the industries that discuss with the governments, for instance, the introduction of domestic carbon pricing and how that revenue then can be redirected to greening the industries that are affected by, for instance, CBAM. But in other countries, we see vice versa, that the governments are trying to engage with the industry and to get industry input on these questions and to convince industry that actually it's good to have a domestic carbon pricing scheme, because then the money, the revenues from the carbon tax stay within the country and can actually benefit domestic industries. On the export rebates, I mean, it's a complex question, but in short, there are significant concerns about WTO compatibility of measures aimed at providing support for exporters covered by the EU ETS. On the emission standards, so when we are talking in the context of the CBAM, you could essentially, there are different aspects that could be covered by standards. I think the most obvious one is the carbon emission accounting. And for that, there are standard setting organizations, for instance, the ISO, that has certain carbon standards already in place. The question is then whether they should be more industry specific and whether there should be more work done for specific purposes of the carbon border adjustments. In terms of SMEs, effect on SMEs and default values, honestly, what we see, it's not only the SMEs that are thinking to resort to default values. In effect, as I said, I think it's a common business practice. When you have a new regulatory framework that imposes additional costs, you calculate your compliance costs. And that was one of the first questions we received actually from some of our clients when the EU just made its proposal on the CBAM. It's how do you think can we calculate the compliance costs in terms of what's going to be the carbon price. Then they want to know, they looked at internally what it may cost them to implement the carbon emission monitoring scheme, to resort to actual carbon emission values. And then they compare that with the costs that arise if they rely on default values. And what we understand in some cases, they said, well, it might actually make more sense just to rely on default values. The WTO compatibility is a separate, as well, complex question, but indeed there are quite some questions because default values, especially the second option for the default values, is quite punitive and not really very fair. And in terms of the carbon capture and storage, yes, the industries have been asking us this, foreign producers have been asking us this question, not only about carbon capture and storage, but in general about carbon removals. Because in some countries it's possible, and in the early days of the EU ETS there was also a possibility, as far as I recall, to use the international carbon credits, but not anymore. So yes, this question is also on the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. I turn to Dr. Wurdu because I question directly
Yes, a few
to you.
sentences, thank you. Actually, between 2013 and 20, Turkey built a set of strong foundations for implementing carbon pricing in context of its program with World Bank Partnership for Market Readiness, and this was including the ETS system. So in our 12-month medium-term program, we are also covering the period of 2023 and 2025, and this ensures an establishment of a national ETS which will be effectively functioning with CBAM, which will be aligned with CBAM, because it's very important for our country to be aligned with the rules and regulations of EU CBAM in order to have the advantage of completely exempting Turkish exports from the CBAM. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wurdu. Let me thank all of the panelists, but also all the participants. If you like the session, don't hesitate to fill in our post-event survey, but most importantly, grab a coffee. Please continue the exchanges that I already see being made, and enjoy the other sessions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.